The lecture that we're going to consider today is Introduction to Reasoning. And note, by the way, that if you need to contact me, my email address here is ross.colebrook@baruch.cuny.edu. Today we're going to cover, like I mentioned, Introduction to Reasoning, which involves a lot of really basic concepts that are really similar to your common sense, but in fact slightly different in ways that can trip you up. So if something seems commonsensical to you, make sure to pay a little closer attention because it may not be the exact concept you already have. We're going to start with the basic constituents of reasoning. So first of all, reasoning is composed of thoughts that assert something. So here are a few examples of thoughts that assert something. A triangle has 3 sides. There are stars in the sky. Every dog is a mammal. You shouldn't nuke hurricanes. You won't need an umbrella today. Each of these thoughts asserts something. And by assert something, I mean they say the world is a certain way, right? And as a result, they are what philosophers call truth apt. They're the kind of statement that can be true or false. Now, one thing to be really careful about here is that when I say they're the kind of thing that could be true or false, I don't mean that we don't know whether they're true or false. What I mean is that they are semantically the kind of thing that can be true or false. As a result of their meaning, what they're about, right, they can be true or false. But not all thinking is like that. So we use our linguistic thought in lots of different ways, and not all of it asserts something. Some thoughts can't be part of an argument because they don't assert something, right? So here's a few examples. This is the case with expressives like boo or ew, gross. Note that if I asked you, is it true that boo? You would say, what are you talking about? It doesn't make any sense, right? The reason for that is that boo, unlike statements like it is raining, only serves to express our feelings. It doesn't, in fact, make a claim about the world that could end up true or false depending on the way the world is, right? Same thing with ew, gross. This is also true for imperatives. So imperatives are statements that order someone to do something, or if they're being more polite, suggest that somebody does something, right? Like close the door or turn up the thermostat, please. Each of these statements does get some meaning across, but it's not meaning that is truth apt. It's not something that can be true or false. So again, if I said, is it true that close the door? You would think I was confused about what you had said, right? Or I didn't understand the phrase, right? And that's because imperatives just have this different linguistic function. So I bring these up to make it clear what we're talking about when we're talking about statements that assert something. These are statements that are truth apt. They're the kind of thing that can be true or false. And those are the basic constituents of reasoning. So what we're not talking about is expressives or imperatives. We're not talking about these other uses of language that are also really important to our thinking, but that can't form part of an argument, right? So thoughts that assert something are the basic constituents of arguments, and that's what we're considering today. So reasoning can be thought, said, or written, and we're going to consider mostly written argument in this class, but you should note that any kind of reasoning in whatever medium can count. Moreover, in this portion of the class at the beginning here, we're going to be talking about explicit, that is spelled out reasoning. Reasoning where we can think about each of the steps in turn and see how each one follows from the other. This can be distinguished from implicit reasoning. So there's a lot of reasoning that you do where you must have gone through some kind of rational process or some kind of irrational process maybe, but it's all implicit. It's in the background of your consciousness. It's behind your consciousness. And what arrives at your consciousness is just a complete thought as a kind of intuition or something that seems obvious to you. So we're considering explicit reasoning, not implicit reasoning. Later on in this class, though, we will consider all the ways that our implicit reasoning can go wrong. But for now, we're talking about the right and wrong ways that our explicit reasoning can go right or wrong. To be clear, when we spell out our reasoning in each step, right, this constitutes an argument. Here's my dog, Herbert. We're going to be using him as an example for how arguments are structured. So we're going to start really simple here. Take the following argument. This argument is composed of two simple thoughts put into certain logical relationships. The first is Herbert is on a walk, and the second simple thought is Herbert is eating garbage. This argument sets up a conditional relationship between these two simple thoughts, that if he's on a walk, then he's eating garbage. It then asserts that the first part of this conditional is true. He is, in fact, on a walk right now. And then the conclusion of this argument, and we'll get into premises and conclusions in a moment, says that he definitely is eating garbage, right? So, as I said, it's composed of two simple thoughts. Herbert is on a walk, and Herbert is eating garbage. And notice how one of these things, in fact, this claim that Herbert is eating garbage, is the thing being supported by this other claim that Herbert is on a walk. Now, in critical thinking, logic, and philosophy more broadly, we often put arguments into what's called premise-conclusion format. And this is just a way of making it really explicit what counts as the support for an argument and what counts as the major conclusion of the argument. So a premise is a claim that provides a reason for another claim. It's the thing doing the supporting. And a conclusion is the claim that's being supported, right? Now, this may seem really obvious and really simple, but in fact, a lot of error in reasoning results from people mistaking premises for conclusions. And it's not always immediately obvious what counts as the premise or the conclusion. So what I'm going to do here today is try and give you some tools to allow you to distinguish these things. Here I should note that a lot of the concepts that we're going to talk about later in this class depend on this skill, your ability to distinguish premises from conclusions, right? So this is a really important skill that I think a lot of error results from not actually deploying this skill properly. So here's that argument that we were considering put into premise-conclusion format. If Herbert is on a walk, then Herbert is eating garbage, that conditional statement. Herbert's on a walk, therefore he's eating garbage. I use this example, of course, because I live in a very dirty neighborhood in Brooklyn where there's garbage everywhere and the dogs love it. But the way that this is set up is these two first claims are premises, and this line indicates that the thing that comes after the line is a conclusion, right? So you might read the line as therefore. So putting this all together, if Herbert is on a walk, then Herbert is eating garbage. Herbert's on a walk, therefore Herbert is eating garbage. So these first two claims are premises, and the third claim is a conclusion. Now, premises and conclusions are defined by the purpose that they serve in the argument. If a thought is the support for some other thought, then it is a premise. If it is the main point that's being supported by other thoughts, it is the conclusion, right? That's what makes a thought a premise or a conclusion. Basically, why did somebody say this thing? What was their purpose argumentatively in saying it? It's either that it's supporting something that they're saying, or it is the main point for which they've provided support somewhere else, right? That's what makes something a premise or a conclusion. But English, like a lot of other languages, is full of premise and conclusion indicators, things that make it clear, that signal to your mind when you read them that the next complete thought ought to be treated a certain way. So premise indicators, to start, are words that indicate that the next complete thought is a premise, right? That makes sense. And the same thing with conclusion indicators. The next complete thought is a conclusion. And here we just have a list of premise indicators. because, since, for, given that, assuming that, right, et cetera, et cetera. When you are answering some of the questions in the homework, you're going to want to refer back to this list. And the same point applies here. When you're answering questions in the homework, you're going to be looking for some of these indicators that, in this case, indicate conclusions. Compare the following two arguments. The first one is, I was late because the bus was late. Now, this is an argument because it has two different thoughts that are put into a logical relationship with each other where one supports the other. So in this case, I was late is being supported by the bus was late, right? If you ask yourself, what is the reason why I was late that this argument is giving? Well, it's that the bus was late. This because is a premise indicator, right? Because it indicates that the thing that follows it, the next complete thought, in this case, the bus was late, is a premise, right? And note that premises can show up, or conclusions, by the way, anywhere in the argument. They could be in the middle, at the beginning, at the end. In an unreconstructed argument, that is an argument as you find it just in the wild, the premise or conclusions can come anywhere. Now compare this argument to another argument that uses the exact same thoughts, but that puts them in a different logical relationship. I was late, so the bus was late. These have, again, the same thoughts here, right? I was late, the bus was late. But because we're using a different indicator, in this case, so, which is a conclusion indicator, it completely shifts the meaning of the argument. So this so indicates that this thought right here, the bus was late, is the conclusion, and that I was late is the premise. What that means is that this whole statement, I was late, so the bus was late, has a different meaning. Where before it might have meant, when we were talking about I was late because the bus was late, that's me explaining why I was late, right? Giving a reason for why I was late. Now, I was late serves as the reason, right, for the bus being late. So that would be something like, I'm a bus driver, and so the bus was late because I was late, right? Or I was holding up the bus. Either of those cases might be the best interpretation of that argument. But notice how indicators can completely change the meaning of the argument based on giving us an indication of how we ought to treat each of the thoughts in the argument, whether they are a premise or a conclusion. A really important skill in this class is going to be identifying arguments and separating them out from non-arguments. Now, it's really important to notice that not every series of statements counts as an argument, right? So here's an example of a series of statements that just kind of gives us a list of facts, but doesn't qualify as an argument because there are no indicators that might tell us that something is a premise or a conclusion. And we can't infer based on the facts that are being said that anything ought to be treated as a premise or a conclusion. So if a series of statements doesn't have a clear premise or conclusion in it, it doesn't have something doing the supporting, that's the premise, or the thing being supported, that's the conclusion, it doesn't count as an argument. So the cost of the new fighter plane is $650 million. The cost of 3 of these fighter bombers is $1.2 billion. The administration intends to fund such projects. That's not an argument. It's just a series of facts that you might see reported in the newspaper, right? Same thing here. This is just a story about something that happens to somebody. So Alicia went to the bank to get a more recent statement of her checking account. The teller told her that the balance was $1,700 and she thought that was really low. And she called her brother to see if it was one of his pranks, but it wasn't. So she finally realized that she'd been the victim of bank fraud. Notice that this is kind of a story that recounts all these facts about what happened to this lady, right? But it doesn't count as an argument because none of these facts is being offered as a reason to support any of the other facts, right? And that's an important differentiator between arguments and non-arguments. Arguments will always provide in the series of statements some reason to believe one other statement in the series of statements, right? That's what arguments will always do. Sometimes we have series of statements that don't just read like a set of facts just being reported, but seem persuasive based on the type of language being used. But it's pretty important to note that unless the argument actually logically supports one part with another, right, whether or not that logical support is any good, it doesn't count as an argument. So simply sounding persuasive doesn't on its own make an argument out of a series of statements. So here's an example of something that doesn't technically count as an argument, even though it sounds kind of persuasive. So attributing alcohol abuse by children too young to buy a drink to lack of parental discipline, intense pressure to succeed, and affluence incorrectly draws attention to the proximate causes while ignoring the ultimate cause. A culture that tolerates overt and covert marketing of alcohol, tobacco, and sex to easily manipulated, voracious consumers. Note that this doesn't count as an argument. In fact, it's really one long thought phrased in kind of persuasive garb, but you can't separate out any particular part of it that counts as one thought that's being supported by other thoughts. And that's what means that it's not, in fact, an argument in this case. Another important thing you're going to do in this class is distinguish conditionals from arguments. A conditional statement is any statement of the form if P, then Q, where P and Q are single thoughts. So for example, this is a conditional statement. If it's sunny, then we'll play baseball. This conditional statement is composed of two single thoughts, right, put in a certain logical relationship. It's sunny and we'll play baseball, right? This conditional statement, like all conditional statements, is true if in fact there is this logical relationship between these two states of affairs in the world, where it being sunny means that we're playing baseball, right? But this statement, even though it may be true, does not count as an argument. And part of the reason for that is that this first part, it's sunny, is not being asserted in the conditional statement. And the same thing is true for the second part. Conditional statements do not assert either of their parts. Instead, they just say that if either of these things is true, they're going to be in this logical relationship, right? But if I say, if it's sunny, then we'll play baseball, that does not imply that it's sunny, right? It might be raining right now, and I could say, if it's sunny, then we'll play baseball, but in fact, the first part isn't true. It might also be true that it's sunny, but in fact, we'll do something else. Rather than playing baseball, we will play volleyball, right? So the point here is that this doesn't count as an argument. Unless you see either of these single parts of the conditional statement actually asserted, the argument, there is no argument here, right? To make this an argument, you would have to add a little more, right? So you'd have to actually assert this, this single claim that comes up in the conditional. So whereas this first instance, right, of it's sunny is not actually being asserted because it's part of this conditional statement, this second instance, right, is being asserted because it's just being said. If I say it'll be sunny, that's in fact asserting the claim that it's going to be sunny. It is true in situations where it ends up being sunny, and false in situations where it ends up not being sunny. Notice also that this counts as an argument because it's got an indicator, right? So is a conclusion indicator. And that shows us, or it signals to our mind, that this claim, we'll play baseball, is in fact a conclusion. So to sum up here, conditional statements, just statements of the form if P then Q, are not in fact arguments. And you have to actually assert some part of the conditional statement on its own in order for it to count as an argument. So any if P then Q type of statement doesn't on its own count as an argument. Now we're going to get into some basic concepts that have analogs in your common sense, but are a little bit different and mean something really specific when we're talking about them in the context of this class. And the first thing we're going to consider here in this category is truth versus falsity. So everybody has kind of a common sense understanding of what truth is and what it is for something to be false. But we're going to use this concept or these concepts in a really specific way in this class, and a way that I'm going to be testing you on. So you have to be really careful that you don't accidentally slip into a more commonsensical usage of it. So this is pretty similar to the common sense idea, but it's a little different. So basically, a statement is true when its content corresponds with the way the world is. Now, this is what's known as the correspondence theory of truth in philosophy. And I should mention that there are a lot of other theories of truth. There's the coherence theory of truth, and there's the deflationary theory of truth. There are a bunch of other theories of truth, right? But the one we're going to use here is this correspondence theory of truth. And it's one that philosophers often argue is implicit in common sense, even though people don't often talk about it. The basic idea here is that a statement's content, its meaning, right, has to match up or correspond, right, with the way the world really is. So for example, if I say, if I look at a chair and I say, that's a chair, right, my statement is true. If I look at a chair and I think, that's an elephant, right, then my statement, or my thought in that case, is false, right? So the content, what the meaning of the statement is, needs to match up with the way the world is, right? And that is the only requirement for truth, matching up with the way the world is. Now notice what I have not mentioned, right, that may sometimes be included in the common sense idea of truth, which is justification. So if I look at a chair and I say, that's a chair, my statement is true simply because it matches up with the way the world is. It doesn't matter whether I'm justified in thinking it's a chair, whether I have good reason to believe it. Notice another thing that is not included in this definition. So it does not matter what people believe for whether my statement is true. So if I look at a chair and I say, that's a chair, that statement is true even if everybody in the world believes that it's something else, like an elephant, right? So truth and falsity do not depend on justification, that is the reason why we believe something, and they do not depend on what other people believe, right? And so furthermore, simply believing something doesn't make it true. So what this leaves out, what this purposely excludes, is something that often creeps into our thinking about truth, which is we often have a kind of subjectivist version of truth that I'm going to warn you against in this class, right? I'm not saying it's necessarily false, but people will often say, well, something's true for him or it's true for her, right? And that's not the usage of truth that we're going to use in this class, right? According to this theory of truth, the correspondence theory of truth, the statement is true just when it corresponds with the way the world really is, irrespective of what anybody believes and the evidence anybody has, right? And then conversely, a statement is false then when its content does not correspond with the way the world is, right? So it doesn't depend on justification, doesn't depend on what people believe. So let's talk a little bit about justification, because justification is, again, one of these concepts that we may have already, but that has a specific usage when we're talking about it in the context of philosophy, right? So a statement is justified in general when a person has good reasons for believing that statement. And like I said, justification is not the same thing as truth. So whether something is true or false just depends on whether its content, its meaning, matches up with the way the world in fact is. And whether a statement is justified depends on whether the person has good reasons for believing that statement, right? And notice those are two totally different criteria, right? Two totally different things. So as a result, and I will be testing you on this, statements can be true and justified when what somebody believes is true because it matches up with the way the world in fact is, and justified because they have good reasons for believing it. Statements can also be true and unjustified when the statement matches up with the way the world is, but the person's reasons for believing it are not good, right, or not part of a reliable truth tracking process. Statements can also be false and justified. So there are cases where we say something that ends up being false, or we believe something that ends up being false because it just doesn't happen to match up with the way the world is. And yet, nevertheless, we had really good reasons for believing that thing, right? Finally, statements are also false and unjustified sometimes. False when it doesn't match up with the way the world is, and unjustified when we believe it for bad reasons. Now, most things we believe are in this first category or this fourth category, right? But there are weird cases, like I said, where we get true and unjustified statements or false and justified statements. Just to give you a little demonstration here, this statement that this person thinks, that's a chair, when looking at a chair under normal conditions, is both true and justified. It's true because the meaning of the statement, that's a chair, matches up with the world, right? So if this guy sees this chair under normal conditions, it's true when he thinks that's a chair, right? It's also justified because if it's right in front of him and there aren't any weird things going on, usually you're justified in forming beliefs or making statements about things that are right in front of you under normal conditions, right? So what makes it true is the fact that his statement's content, the meaning of it, matches up with the world, and for a totally different reason, it's justified. That is, there are normal conditions and it's a thing right in front of him. So things can get a little wacky, though, if we change the scenario a bit. Suppose there really is this chair sitting out here in the world, and suppose this guy comes along and says the phrase, or thinks the phrase, that's a chair, right? Well, that statement is in fact true because it matches up with the way the world really is, right? But under ordinary circumstances, I should say, that would be a justified belief, right? Because you're justified in believing things that are right in front of you, right? And based on your senses under ordinary conditions. But suppose these aren't ordinary conditions. Instead, this little wizard guy has cast a spell on this guy, and the spell makes it such that anything he sees will appear to him to be a chair, right? Well, what that means is that it's kind of an accident, it's a lucky accident, that he forms the belief that this thing, right, this thing is a chair. Because after all, if he had run into an elephant or anything else, he would have thought that was a chair because of this spell that he's being put under, right? So what that means is this process, these conditions are unusual. They're not truth tracking. He would believe anything that he saw is a chair, and as a result, his belief, his statement or his thought is unjustified, right? Because it's a kind of happy accident that it matches up with the way the world is. So this is a case of a belief or a statement or a thought being true because it matches up with the way the world is, but unjustified because the process by which he came to this belief was not a good one, was not a truth tracking one. We'll vary the scenario one more time here. So suppose this guy comes along and he sees what to him appears to be a chair, right? Now, under ordinary circumstances, stuff that's right in front of you when you are of sound mind and sober is stuff that you can draw a conclusion about without any further, more detailed investigation necessary to render your judgment justified, right? So when this guy makes this statement, that's a chair, under normal circumstances, if this thing is right in front of him and he's of sound mind, that's a justified belief, right? It's a justified thought. But suppose that, unbeknownst to this guy, a wizard has cast a spell on this elephant, making it appear as though it's a chair, right? Well, notice that that means that this elephant that's actually out here in the real world walking around is not something that matches up with the content of this guy's statement, right? And as a result, the statement is false, right? Well, it's still justified, though, because under normal circumstances, you're justified in believing something that's right in front of you, right? It just so happens, though, that this thing has been disguised in a very clever way by this spell from the wizard and appears to be a chair, right? So in this case, this person's belief is false because it doesn't match up with reality, but it is justified because, again, you're justified in believing something that's right in front of you. Finally, fairly simply, a belief is false and unjustified when it doesn't match up with reality, and the process that you use to arrive at that belief is not a good one, right? Is not truth tracking. So in this case, this guy looks at this elephant that's right in front of him and thinks, that's a chair, right? Well, that belief is false because it does not match up with reality, right? It's unjustified because he has no reason to believe that it's a chair, right? Every piece of evidence he has in front of him shows that it is in fact an elephant, all right? And yet he nevertheless comes to the conclusion that it's a chair, right? So that is a false and unjustified belief. Its content doesn't match reality, and the process by which this guy arrived at it doesn't provide any evidence for the belief at all. Another important concept that's important for critical thinking is consistency. This is a concept that has, like the others, analogs in common sense, but when we talk about it in the context of philosophy and critical thinking more generally, it has a pretty specific meaning. So a set of thoughts is consistent if all of those thoughts could be true at the same time, right? And here's a really important thing. The thoughts don't have to actually be true. So, for example, think about whether this set is consistent. Herbert loves garbage. Gorgons can turn you to stone with a single stare, right? Now, you may have thought at first, and this is a common mistake, that these things are not related to each other at all, and so they can't possibly be consistent. But actually, the relationship goes the exact opposite direction. If things are totally unrelated, it's in fact easier for them to be consistent because they can't contradict each other, right? So it could be true that Herbert loves garbage, and Herbert loving garbage doesn't mean that Gorgons can't turn you to stone with a single stare. The same thing is true vice versa. Maybe Gorgons have that ability, and that doesn't stop Herbert from loving garbage, right? So a set of beliefs is consistent if all of them could be true at the same time without stopping any of the others from being true, right? As long as they don't contradict each other, they count as consistent, and they don't have to have anything to do with each other at all. So here's another example. Julie is a certified public accountant. Julie has never worked with numbers. Now, notice that the fact that she has never worked, or the apparent fact that she has never worked with numbers seems to contradict the claim that she is a certified public accountant. You can't become a certified public accountant without at least working with numbers sometimes, right? As a result, this set is inconsistent, right? If one of them is true, that she's a certified public accountant, the other has to be false, that she has never worked with numbers, and vice versa. And that's what consistency is all about. Could all of the statements be true at the same time, or do they contradict each other? Now, in trying to think about consistency, it's important to distinguish between false beliefs, beliefs that don't match up with the world, right, where their content doesn't match the world, and conceptually impossible thoughts who have content that couldn't match any imagined world, right? Now, false thoughts or beliefs can be put into a set of other beliefs, and the set can still be consistent because it doesn't really matter whether a statement is true or not. All that matters for it to be consistent with other ones, all that matters is that it doesn't contradict other statements. But conceptually impossible thoughts are thoughts that can't be true in any even imagined world. And as a result, when you put them into a set of beliefs with other thoughts, or a set of other thoughts, right, they make the set inconsistent every time because the set couldn't be true all at the same time because one of them is always false. So here's a few examples of these conceptually impossible thoughts. They are impossible, conceptually impossible, because of their concepts, right? Because of the concepts involved. So all triangles have 4 sides. Note that if something is a triangle, it must have 3 sides, right? So saying that all triangles have 4 sides is conceptually impossible. if you put this thought into a set of thoughts or beliefs, um, any set or thoughts or beliefs, right? It's going to be an inconsistent set, right? Same thing with some bachelors are married. So the meaning of bachelor is unmarried man, right? And as a result, if we say some bachelors are married, that in fact is conceptually impossible. Couldn't possibly be true even in any imagined world, because if we try and imagine a world where there are married bachelors, we end up contradicting ourselves, right? So any set that we put this belief into will be an inconsistent set. Same thing with no dog is a canine. Well, all dogs are canines, in fact. So saying no dog is a canine is conceptually impossible, right? It's not something it doesn't make sense in any possible world. You couldn't write a book that had where no dog was a canine, right? In some sense, conceptually impossible thoughts are thoughts that you can't even think correctly, right? You end up contradicting yourself and even imagining them. So it's important to distinguish these kinds of thoughts from thoughts that are merely false. A thought that's false just doesn't match up with the world, but a conceptually impossible thought is one that couldn't match up with any imagined world, right? And remember, if you put a false thought into a set with other thoughts, it can still be consistent as long as it doesn't contradict all the other thoughts, right? The set of beliefs can still be consistent. But a conceptually impossible thought will always render any set that you put it into inconsistent. Another foundational concept in this class is logical connectedness. This describes the relationship between the premises in an argument and the conclusion, where remember, the premises are the things doing the supporting and the conclusion is the thing being supported, right? Logical connectedness comes in varying degrees. So strong logical connectedness is when if the premises were true, they would give us good enough reason to believe the conclusion, right? They support the conclusion quite well, meaning that we should believe the conclusion as long as we believe the premises. Note that that doesn't mean that the premises actually are true. You can have an argument that has strong logical connectedness even though the premises are false, and so technically we shouldn't believe the conclusion. But if the premises had been true, the degree of logical connectedness means that we should have believed the conclusion. Compare this with weak logical connectedness, which is where even if the premises were true, they wouldn't give us enough reason to believe the conclusion. This is where the premises just don't support or aren't connected enough to the conclusion to give us good reason to believe it, right? And finally, failed logical connectedness, where even if the premises were true, they would give us zero reason, no reason at all to believe the conclusion. And this typically happens in really disordered thinking where the premises just aren't even related to the conclusion. So here are a few examples of strong, weak, and failed logical connectedness. This first one is strong. Of the tens of thousands of airline flights, only 15 involved fatal crashes in 2018. If that is true, right, and I think it is true, then the conclusion is quite well supported. That the fact that there are tens of thousands of airline flights and very few, a very tiny number of them actually involve a fatal crash means that it is pretty safe for you to fly by air. Notice that it doesn't need to be absolutely guaranteed for something to be pretty strong, for something to have a strong degree of logical connectedness. Furthermore, I should mention, the strength of an argument's logical connectedness will sometimes depend on the context. So in situations where there's really high stakes, you want to be fairly sure that if the premises are true, they support the conclusion. But an argument can have strong logical connectedness if the stakes are pretty low, right? Then the requirement for evidence is a little lower, right? So it does depend on context, but I won't give you any examples that require you to really suss out the context. I'm just going to be trying to test you on, are you able to draw this distinction between strong, weak, and failed? Now, here's another one. In a recent study, 1% of students who did not study for their logic midterms failed, so therefore you should study for your logic midterm. Notice how if it's true that only 1% who did not study failed, well then that's a pretty easy test, right? That means that pretty much you just got to write your name on it. And so that barely supports the claim that you should study for your logic midterm, right? After all, most people who didn't study passed it anyway. And as a result, this is an argument with weak logical connectedness. Now notice that it's not completely failed, because at least the premise here is related to the conclusion. It just doesn't give us enough reason to believe the conclusion, right? The fact that 1% failed is not a good enough reason to believe that you should study, right? Now that's not the way that this class is going to work. Finally, this argument has totally failed logical connectedness. The moon landing was the most impressive feat of engineering in the 20th century. Therefore, you should eat a peanut butter and jelly sandwich for lunch. The premise, even if it's true, and in fact it is, right, has nothing at all to do with the conclusion. And it being true doesn't support the conclusion or give us any reason to believe it whatsoever. And that's what makes this argument failed as opposed to weak, right? Weak is at least related. It just doesn't give us enough reason. Failed is unrelated generally and definitely gives you no reason whatsoever to believe the conclusion. Okay, summing up, we've talked about arguments versus non-arguments, especially distinguishing arguments from conditionals and a mere reportage of facts. We've also talked about identifying premises and conclusions, right? Using premise and conclusion indicators and recognizing that the purpose of a premise is to support something and the purpose of a conclusion is to be supported by something else. We've also talked about truth and falsity, and remember that truth, for the purposes of this class, is just matching up with the world, right? And nothing else, right? So it doesn't matter whether everybody believes it. It doesn't matter whether anybody is justified. All that matters is whether what you say or think actually matches up with reality as it really is. And we've also talked about distinguishing truth from justification, right? So justification is having adequate reason to believe what you believe, right? And that is different from whether your statement is true or false, right? We've also talked about consistency, which is when a set of beliefs could all be true at the same time. It's taking special care to distinguish statements that are merely false, which could be consistent with other statements, and statements that are conceptually impossible, which could never be consistent with any other statements, right? And finally, we've talked about logical connectedness, which is the degree to which an argument's premises support its conclusion. And that'll be it for this module. Thank you.